Welcome to Migration Policy Institute. Great to have you here today. Welcome to everyone who is on the live stream as well. It is a pleasure to be working today with, I'm going to sit down as we talk actually, the Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center at Southern Methodist University, and Luisa del Rosal. So great to partner with you on today's event.
It's our pleasure, honestly, to be with such giants of the
Well, no, this is our first, it's not our first collaboration. It's our first formal collaboration.
Exactly.
But we've done a number of things together, actually, both in Dallas and here. So great to actually have a partnered event. Great to be with my colleague Ariel Reis. I'll introduce both of them in a moment. But I'm Andrew Seeley. The name tag, I think, says that. So I am Andrew Seeley, but I'm supposed to tell you that, so I am. Welcome to A Mirror for the Nation, the changing profile of Mexican immigrants in Texas. We're actually going to talk about Mexican immigrants in Texas, but also in the United States as a whole. What we've done as part of this partnership is look at the changing profile of Mexican immigration in the United States and Texas in particular, but we've also looked broadly across the nation. Good morning, Kathleen, good to see you. It is much of the debate in this country around immigration is framed by the narrative around illegal immigration from Mexico. As we know, that is considerably down. In fact, there are more unauthorized immigrants today coming across the border from Guatemala and Honduras than from Mexico, which is surprising. Thank you, Jessica, for running the latest numbers. Saw you. There you are, Jessica. I saw you a second ago. And I mean, but also one of the things, and that we know and that we've talked about, but one of the things that we wanted to look at, and Ariel Luis and I were, Partisan Michelle and a few other people, was trying to figure out what the profile of Mexican immigrants was, because we're also framed by the notion that Mexican immigrants are primarily low-skilled immigrants, and it seemed that probably had changed over time. And so what we find, I don't want to steal Ariel's thunder, he's going to give you the results in a second, but in fact there is a dramatic change in the profile of Mexican immigrants coming to the United States. As Mexico has changed, and there's a higher educated population in Mexico, but also as more migration has come through legal channels rather than unauthorized immigration across the border, and there have been channels for temporary migration, the profile of people coming from Mexico to the United States has changed. And this is happening at a time where actually the number of Mexican immigrants in the United States is dropping, but that is, we will talk about that at another meeting. We have, Ariel and I are working on another paper with Colegio de Mexico, which will come out in a couple months, that looks at the broader changes going on in this population. You can today tweet questions at Migration Policy, for those that want to do that. You can use the hashtag MPI Discuss. You can email events@migrationpolicy.org. That's especially for those of you in the live cast. And for the rest of you who are actually here, we can do it the old-fashioned way and raise your hand when we get to the question and answer period. Before that, we've left you a copy of the profile, I think, on your chair, so everyone should have it, is this document. Welcome, and let me turn this over. First of all, I'm going to introduce you both together, and I'll introduce you as you go. So let me turn over to Ariel, who is going to present the results of the study, and then Luisa will talk about it. I'll introduce you in a second. Ariel is Associate Policy Analyst here at MPI, my colleague. His research focuses on the impact of U.S. immigration policies on immigrants' experiences of socioeconomic integration across varying geographical and political contexts. He also focuses on Mexico and Central America migration, in particular, where we've had a chance to work quite a bit together. His research has been published in Latino Studies and Crossing in the United States-Mexico Border, a book from University of Texas Press. He also has a master's degree from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree from Whitman College. Ariel, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Also, those joining us via live stream, thank you for making the time to be part of this important conversation. I want to thank again our partners at SMU for doing this collaboration with us. We have learned a lot about, we continue to learn a lot about Mexican immigrants, and specifically the context in Texas will be very important, as I will suggest in a moment. So our research today really focuses on the profile of highly skilled Mexican immigrants, and by highly skilled, I want to make sure I make clear from the beginning, but highly skilled, we consider immigrants ages 25 or older that have reported having a bachelor's degree or higher, regardless of whether they obtained their degree in the United States or in Mexico. So that is the population that we're working with. Those people who have received this high level of education here in the US or in Mexico, and as we will conclude with some questions, what it means for their trajectory once they are here in the United States. again, we want to try to explore the profile, not just thinking about the demographics, but also talk about a little bit about the labor market expectations that they have and seeing where they can fare in the future. As Andrew mentioned, our results right now come at a time when the U.S. debate related to migration is really centered around Mexican migration, despite changes that we've seen in the flows now much more predominantly from Central America. So I think, right. I'd like to start by showing the trend of the broader immigration population, which looks, again, and this is not the first time I should note that we look at this type of population of highly skilled immigrants, but it is the first time that we are making the comparison for Mexicans. So following the trend of broader immigration population, education attainment of Mexican immigrants has risen considerably. The number of Mexican college graduates has increased from 269,000 in 2000 to 678,000 in 2017. Today, Mexicans are the fourth largest group of high-skilled immigrants in the country, after those from India, which is 1.8 million, China, 995,000, and the Philippines at 906,000. Increasing in education attainment is primarily explained, as Andrew mentioned, with rising education, college attainment among recent arrivals. And the key reason about this graph, as I'll mention in a second, is trying to understand how the recent arrivals are affecting the overall stock of immigrant population here in the United States. And by recent immigrants, I should be clear, we mean cohorts of immigrants who entered in the last 5 years at each time. So for example, in the figure that you're seeing right now, those in 2017 that are recent arrivals are those that came in between 5 years before, including 5 years, 2017 and 5 years prior, which are the darker bars. And then the lighter bars is the stock of immigrant population. And I'll make some comparisons in a moment. But first, let me start by saying that there are 185,000 college-educated Mexicans in Texas, and that Texas is the second largest state or has the second largest population of highly skilled Mexican immigrants after California, which is a reflection of the proximity and deep economic ties that Mexicans have to the state. This population is more than 3 times larger than it was in 2000 when it was 61,000. So again, from 61,000 highly skilled Mexicans in 2000, now Texas is home to 185,000. And that's an important contrast, as Andrew mentioned. So the figure that you have in front of you shows the share of Mexicans with college degrees among the two populations that I mentioned, those in the lighter bars, which is the total stock, and then the darker bars, which is the recent flows. You see that in 2017, 7% of Mexicans in the United States and 8% of those in Texas had a college degree. This is compared to 17% of recent Mexican immigrants in the United States and 18% of those in Texas. So the largest increase, as you see in these bars, really happened between 2010 and 2015, when it increased for the recent immigrants in Texas from 13% to 19%, and in the United States from 10 to 17%. Now, we wanted to also emphasize that not only in Texas, but across the different metropolitan areas, there are significant differences that we should explore and be aware about. The first one is, and to do that, we looked at the population characteristics in 5 areas, the five metropolitan areas with the highest populations of highly skilled immigrants: Houston, Dallas, El Paso, McAllen, and San Antonio. These 5 metropolitan areas accounted for 73% of Texas' highly skilled immigrant population. Again, that's 73%. Proportionally, college graduates represented larger shares among Mexican immigrant population in El Paso, you see 13%, McAllen 12%, San Antonio 11%, and Houston with 7%. And then Dallas with 6%. Though the last 2, Dallas and Houston, had the largest in number in terms of population. We didn't include in this figure now, but I also wanted to make sure that we noted that we made also some estimates for the top line numbers for Austin. And in Austin, out of the 50,000 that there remained, 16,000 of them are residing in Austin, and that is about 13% of the total population. So we didn't include it in this figure because of sample size issues, but we do want to make sure to note that's the case. Underscoring the geographic distribution of this population, which is about a quarter of highly skilled immigrants living in other metropolitan areas, that's the 50,000, is important because one of the things that we want to clarify here is that Mexican immigrants across the areas have different dynamics and different characteristics, therefore need different ways to address their current circumstances. And I'll talk more about that at the table at the end. but therefore that's what you can see here. Now, in thinking of the trend, we wanted to look also at the education attainment of Mexicans across time. And so that's why illustrated in this graph, you'll see a red, I'm not sure if you can tell the distinct, all the different colors, but the red and the purple lines, you can see the share of Mexicans in Dallas and Houston, respectively, of the share of them who had a college education, which is very similar beginning in 2000. Those are the two bottom lines. And then until 2010, when you begin to see a shift between both Dallas and Houston, that changes, as I mentioned to you before, because of the recent flows of immigrants, and you get to a similar but still below the green line, which is the state average of highly skilled immigrants, Mexican immigrants, and so therefore they're a little bit below that. Meanwhile, Mexican immigrants in El Paso, San Antonio, McAllen have maintained levels above the state average, which is shown by the green, again, the green dotted line. The increase between 2010 and 2015, in fact, was more pronounced in these metro areas than you can see the light blue and the orange and the yellow lines. And again, this is the share of Mexicans with a college degree. You see that in the end, even though after the 2010-2015 jump, in 2017, El Paso had the largest share of Mexican migrants in the population, followed after McAllen, and then after San Antonio. So that's important for us to know because it tries to create a context of where people may be at. Right. The other factor that we analyzed, it was very important specifically for the Mexican population, is the legal composition, the legal immigration status composition of the Mexican population, really because it helps shape immigrants' access to higher education and stable, well-paid employment that really affect the longer outcomes of this population and populations across the groups, of course. As shown in these pie charts, the composition shows that the majority of Mexican graduates that reside in the United States and Texas is legally residing in the United States. You find that about 70% of both populations in each of those geographies have either become natural citizens, naturalized citizens, are green card holders or legal permanent residents, and of course also some temporary visa holders. Those are students or other H-1B or other highly skilled immigrants. So that is something that is often known and really does go counter to the larger narrative that we have seen nationwide, thinking of Mexican population as really mostly an unskilled population. In fact, the composition of the legal status composition in both the United States and Texas is very similar. The largest share, as I mentioned, is natural citizens. And then to talk about the unauthorized immigrants, which is the blue part of the graphs, about 30% who, as I'll mention in the next slide, really have a different dynamic in how they, or what barriers they face or could potentially face to implement and to exercise the skills that they learned in their education. Okay. So where before the last pie charts we're talking about the composition distribution, this graph here shows you the likelihood that within those groups, those immigrants have a college degree. Of course, among all immigrant adults. The likelihood of having a college degree varied across legal status, as you see here. For example, more than half of temporary visa holders had a bachelor's degree. Those are the two lines, 57% for Texas and 53% for the US. And the nature of the higher numbers is really explained by the fact that most temporary visa holders are admitted in the United States to perform high-skilled jobs or study in US universities, and therefore it makes sense that more of them would have college degrees or are working toward college degrees. About 1 in 10 naturalized citizens had a college degree, which is to your left, the 10 and 12%. That's another population that's important for us to think about. And when we think in the Mexican context, these naturalized citizens often are those that have been in the United States for the longer term, the older Mexican population that we'd find. But perhaps more interestingly, Mexican legal permanent residents and unauthorized immigrants in Texas and actually in the United States had similar likelihoods of having a college degree. And that's something that may be surprising to many. But one of the factors, or at least two of the factors, and one of them specifically in the context of Texas, is that recently the development of the program for deferred action for childhood arrivals, for which Mexicans are the largest group of beneficiaries and have a significant population living in Texas. So part of that, again, not to be everything, but part of that could have have something to do and be explained by that. The other possibility and the other interesting factor for the dynamics in Texas actually is that Texas was the first state to provide in-state tuition for unauthorized immigrants in 2001. So it has had a certain amount of time to try to create and to involve those students who may otherwise not have as equal access to fulfill their degrees. So that's why you may see this here, again, which is a surprising to us element of this composition. Out of maybe, and this is there, I realize there's a lot of numbers in this slide. When you do look at the report, it may be more clear to you. But this really is importantly now looking at the demographic profiles, thinking more specifically about not just the gender, as I mentioned to you, but the actual income possibilities or income factors that Mexican migrants would face to try to provide and to excel in their degrees. More than 1/3, and I'll go over the big talk numbers, but you have seen them, you also have them there. More than 1/3 of college-educated Mexicans living in Texas lived in Houston or Dallas, and the demographic profiles were actually quite similar across both of the largest groups. In both, more than half of Mexican migrants were between the ages of 25 and 44. Compared to Houston, a slightly higher share in Dallas were women, which is an important note to make, and a slightly lower share of them were in poverty. Perhaps most surprisingly, 40% of college Mexican graduates report speaking English less than very well, meaning they were limited English proficient, which is the term that we see in literature. Now, those in El Paso, McAllen, Texas resembled more the state average, but each population did have a unique characteristic that I think deserves some mention. In El Paso, the population was younger, slightly more likely to be female, and with more moderate levels of limited English proficiency and a lower poverty rate. In McAllen, it was a different dynamic, actually. The highly skilled population was older, and they also had significant higher levels in terms of limited English proficiency. In San Antonio, the population was the youngest and had the smallest LAP share in the metro areas. Now, in terms of employment, which is really a big dynamic for this population, proportionally, those in Dallas were participating in the labor force, which is about 83%, higher than in Houston, which was 73%, as noted in the graph. So again, that's 83% in Dallas and 73% in Houston. Highly skilled Mexicans in Dallas were also somewhat less likely to be unemployed. And then for the other three metropolitan areas, the population really resembled the state average, with more than 75% of them in the labor force, and also with relatively lower unemployment rates. So really the comparison here is between Houston and Dallas to try to think about what may be happening there that leads to different outcomes. Now, one of the last things that we looked at about in our characteristics and reports was trying to think about the industries in which Mexican migrants are employed. And we have found that elementary and secondary schools was the largest industry across most metro areas except for Houston, where construction was the largest area of industry of employment for Mexican highly skilled immigrants. And we can talk about some of the reasons of why that was the case. The subsequent industries were, however, much more diverse. You can see we have construction and hospitals appeared across other metro areas, yet only in Houston the legal services rank in the top 5. Restaurants and food services in Dallas was another unique factor, and colleges, universities, and professional schools in El Paso was important as well. In McAllen, wholesale grocery was also something that did not appear to others. Again, we were not able to provide the same level of information for Austin because of sample size, but it is possible that it would have some of the similar industries here. What's most notable about these labor force industry profiles combined is that they suggest that highly skilled Mexican immigrants in Texas may experience significant underemployment. Again, underemployment means, in other words, that Mexican college graduates may not be able to utilize the skills that they earned and that they had in college in their jobs, and therefore they cannot really fulfill the potential that they've acquired, which is an important component that, again, we've looked in other research studies here at MPI, but an important component that nonetheless is critical for Texas and Mexican population there. The last thing I'll conclude by is to look to put things together and to try to talk about how this makes a difference in the long-term nature of this. So we wanted to make sure that to understand not only how these experiences affect one's education profile and outcomes, but how they also work with the communities to create impact in terms of economics, but also integration. And we have found, again, going back to some of the key points that I won't cover, given some of the time, but that it's important for us to think about what does demographic employment characteristics have to say about their future. We have seen, we have heard examples of, for example, cab driver or doctors having, immigrants with having doctors, having degrees in pharmacy or doctors, but working as a cab driver. That type of dynamic that we try to think about in other cases is something that applies here more importantly. And specifically how we see it here is also to think about and certainly the legal status limitations are important to note, especially with the Mexican population, but to also have a more realistic perspective that it does not completely explain for what we've seen. We've seen this in other places. And that in fact, English proficiency, as we've noted in other reports, is extremely important in trying to provide access to immigrants so they can actually apply their skills. And this is obviously tied as well to their recognition of their credentialing. That's another point that we really wanted to assert. Trying to figure out how Mexicans who, for example, have a degree from a university in Mexico can then attain similar certification in the United States to be able to perform that type of career or what they may be having. So we don't want to minimize to any one issue, but to talk more holistically about the process, but to think also well about how, if we could help immigrants achieve more about from their high school or from their university and college education, how much that could have a potential impact in the local population in the States and what that could bring for the United States as a whole. So for now, I'll leave it there and I'll be able to answer some questions at the end.
Thank you, Ariel. I should mention that we have two colleagues, Jana Badalova and Michael Fix, who are working on this last question that Ariel mentioned, broader than Mexican immigrants, but the general question of underemployment of immigrants in the United States, what we call brain waste, the fact that there are people who in fact come with degrees and come with skills that they're not able to use, often because of language barriers or because it is or because they can't get their studies validated in the United States. And so how do we do that? That's because it's lost human capital. Before I introduce, well, Luisa del Rosal, I would say, is the executive director of the Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center at Southern Methodist University, as well as the Tower Center. I should also mention Jenny Eferti, who is the deputy director, associate director, works there, whatever you do,
She
Jenny.
really runs the place.
She really runs the place. She's great. Highly recommend her. We're also very fortunate to have Jim Hollifield, my good friend over here, who is the director of the Tower Center and very distinguished professor at SMU. And great scholar of global migration. So good to have you here. And Ray Rafidi as well, who's the associate director of the Tower Center. So good to have all of you here. And let me say the Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center really was a unique idea. Before I introduce you more, the notion that there are a lot of people focusing on the U.S.-Mexico relationship, but the deepest relationship between the United States and Mexico is in fact in Texas,
Absolutely.
right? The biggest trade relationship, the second biggest population of Mexican immigrants, that there are some unique characteristics that happen between Texas and Mexico. So your center really came to fill that niche that hadn't been dealt with in perhaps the most intense. I was just in Sacramento earlier this week. I love Sacramento. I love California. I lived in California at one point. But California, one of the things you realize is Southern California is a border state and Northern California isn't, right, in the same way. Or it is beginning to be, but it is not quite in the same way. In Northern California, it's much more oriented across the Pacific, actually. Texas is oriented towards Mexico, and it's a complicated but a very dynamic relationship.
We're two great countries, some would
Two
say.
great, yes, exactly. For those that are Texas nationalists, so
exactly.
yes. So Lisa is the founding director of the center, and she was previously at the SMU. We've known each other for a very long time, actually, but previously in various incarnations we've known each other. The SMU Cox School of Business, where you oversaw strategy and development of a new global partnerships to engage in networking, leadership, and business development for the Latino Leadership Initiative, and you were also community relations manager for Education is Freedom. She worked in the Dallas city government. She was born in Chihuahua, Mexico. She graduated from SMU. We actually met when you were a student at SMU many years ago, so known each other through a few incarnations. And She is, if you walk around Dallas and ask people if they know Luisa del Rosal and probably Texas as a whole, you will find probably 3 out of every 4 people because, oh yes, of course I know her. So yes, very well
Thanks,
known
Andrew.
for
Too kind.
many other civic commitments that you have in the community
Thank
as well.
you,
So
Andrew.
Luisa, great to have you here, and
It's
look
so-
forward to your remarks.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and I jokingly aside say two great nations, but Texas does bring a certain caliber, a certain flavor that is very different from the relationship that other states might have with Mexico. Some are louder and prouder maybe, but nobody is more deeply integrated to Mexico and the Mexican economy culturally, socially than Texas. I wanted to say Texicans because that's what I am.
Yes.
I'm a Texas Mexican, and we're deeply integrated. And I know Andrew has been a long champion of furthering this integration, and that's why we've met for so many years. And he's been looking at this question really of what does it mean to be a Mexican migrant in Texas and the United States, and these changing demographics, especially as we see that perception and rhetoric might be a little bit different than what the data really suggests. So I want to thank Andrew and then Ariel, who's been a phenomenal researcher collaborator for really taking this lead. I also want to recognize that Boralachi, who is the program director for the Tower Center, is here, and then our great friend Hiroshi Takayuchi is here as well, who's a distinguished professor at SMU.
Of course.
In Asia and Asian studies. So thank you all for, we hail from Texas and we come big, right? We bring a lot of people. So kind of tying into what Ariel was saying, underemployment of these highly skilled Mexican migrants, why does it matter? And specifically for Texans. So what I'm going to give you is a Texan perspective. So Texas is having record unemployment. So we are currently at 3.8%. If you look at Dallas specifically, we're at 3.4%. In places like West Texas, where we see a booming energy oil industry, we can get good as low as 2.2%. Ultimately, this is having a tremendous impact into our economy. Why? Because we just can't fill jobs fast enough. So it's very interesting as we're looking at this data, as we're thinking about how do we find solutions for workers and employers, and again, Texas is all about free enterprise, how do we make sure that our growing kind of economy really can meet the labor force needs that employers have and are saying. The Dallas Federal Reserve saying, P.R. Renius is an amazing scholar and a senior fellow in our center, said, we're running out of workers. And at some point, it will actually be detrimental to our growing economy because you cannot continue expanding. We have businesses that are saying that they're not moving to other places, that they're not opening new shops because they just cannot find. I have a funny story. The reason that I arrived ultimately in the United States is because a Mexican company that invested in Texas. And I was having a conversation with one of their senior executives, and he said, well, we seriously sometimes have shipments that are full of product that just don't have enough truck drivers to drive them where they need to go. I mean, that is how dire a situation can get in Texas, that we don't have enough people to get the products where they need to be. So we need to figure out how we tap in what Andrew said very well, this brain waste. We are having this large percentage of people that have the ability to live and work in Texas and that have a college degree. And that I'm no dissing of construction, but if we see that in Houston, a lot of them are in construction jobs, is that the best place for their skills? And as we evaluate what are the things we value in skills, shouldn't we be using them and tapping their talents where there need to be? So it prevents growth. We're running out of people for 90 consecutive months. Texas has had this low levels of unemployment. So that is a real concern, and we're going to continue to lower until a point where we just cannot fill jobs, and our economy will slowly stop growing. And that's not something we want. It's a missed opportunity. So we looked at what are some of the policy implications where Texas can really have impact and a difference at the state level. Of course, we are big proponents of comprehensive immigration reform. Andrew knows this. But until the federal government really does their job, we looked at what can Texas do. And that's where we really focused in on this degree certification, degree recognition. Because at the Texas level, we actually can look at ways that the Texas Education Commission or the Texas Education Agency can look at ways of easing that credentialization recognition, which we really believe can help in getting people where they need to be. The second one, so we are going to develop a policy plan in order to propose to the Texas Education Commission to ease that collaboration in degree certification and recognition. Can we look at innovative ways that we develop curriculum together, especially at the university level, where our universities have a great degree of autonomy, could look at partners across the border and look at certificates together. Mexico has a big missed opportunity. The education reform for the past government in Mexico actually wanted to implement English language learning at all levels, so every student would graduate with some knowledge of English. Unfortunately, that education reform is not moving forward. However, it does show
Some
that
would
our
say it's moving backwards,
yeah,
actually.
exactly. That shows, though, that there is an interest on a neighbor to the south looking at English as a way to bridge some gaps that exist between our communities and deepening our integration. I think that was the most shocking thing to find, the limited English proficiency for us in terms of Texas. And I say that it was even more shocking because in another research study that we did with another think tank here in DC, we found that when we asked Texan voters, we specifically did a survey of Texan voters, and when we asked them, one of the kind of key things they would like immigrants to have or to be in order for them to feel they're deeply integrated with Texan was language. And it wasn't a deep knowledge of English, it was conversational English. I say it like this: we all want to celebrate Cinco de Mayo together and order margaritas in English, basically, is what it boils down to. But that also illustrates how it's not only that we see this underemployment because there's not that English proficiency, but that English proficiency is important also for employers, potentially. As we see that Texan voters are interested in that, we wonder if employers are putting a higher burden on immigrants on the English proficiency level. So that's something I was going to discuss with you, that we should look into it.
Yeah, we should.
That we should link to how we defined levels on English that can really help the labor force get more integrated to Texas. So those are the two policy recommendations.
And we have some colleagues here who know a great deal about
Oh,
this.
wonderful.
So, yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we need.
And Leslie, a few others. So, yes.
And the last point is the limited professional networks. So I know that Andrew and Ariel and others here have looked into this limited professional networks. So something we find very interesting is that culturally we would make the assumption that when Mexican migrants arrived into Texas, specifically as it's so close, that they will have these networks. And they do, and they might be familial networks, but maybe they are not as integrated in the professional workforce. So what can we do, and what can nonprofits do, is what we're thinking. What can nonprofits do and to better help them bridge that gap into professional networks? So there is a nonprofit in Texas, specifically in Dallas, that works into the parents of school-aged children, helping them with ESL courses, but helping them also understand how to work in the U.S. system. And these are undocumented and documented, but how we can capitalize on that nonprofit work and look at a more of a state level initiative where we can see how can these nonprofits aid in building those professional networks, because it's already being done at the city level. What can we do it to really, again, tap into this high skilled population that probably might have school age children, and we can tap into their talents. So ultimately, for Texas, this is really a do or die situation. We have another study that we did with a scholar in Mexico that showed that, again, people are moving into Texas. If you didn't know, people are moving into Texas. There's even a really funny saying, don't California my Texas, because so many Californians are moving into Texas. But that's because we have a growing labor market. However, if we won't keep growing, if we don't tap into this really great potential that we have and this deep integration we already have with Mexico, given that these Mexican migrants are already here, are established, and like Ariel pointed out, some of them are naturalized citizens, some of them are green card holders, so they're here for the long run. And so it's better to already build what we have and train them and make sure that we can tap into their potential than having to look elsewhere for those workers, which is what Texas will ultimately have to start looking at in order to fill so many positions, from low skilled to high skilled. So ultimately, for us, this is something the state can really look into in those three different policy dimensions that can help us, our economy, keep growing. So those are my reactions, Andrew.
Good, thank you. With this, we can actually open it up for conversation. So here we have a lot of people that know these issues well. There is both a descriptive piece. We found, in fact, there's a changing Mexican population, mixed and immigrant population in the United States. More so than I think we suspected even, I mean, which was great. But we also found some real barriers there. And so there's a bit of a prescriptive set of questions that emerge from this as well of, what do you do next to actually tap the human talent that is there, the talent and the human capital is there. Let's open up for questions. You can tweet at us. You can send us messages, events@migrationpolicy.org. You can tweet to @migrationpolicy. And you can also use the hashtag MPI Discuss. Any of those things, if you're outside the room, will get to us, and we will get your questions. And if you're inside the room, please raise your hand. And look forward to your questions, comments, and thoughts. So, please, good to have you here.
Thank you. It was very interesting. So I'm Hiroshi Takeuchi at SMU. So, today's discussion sounds like I'm still in Texas, but my question is exactly that point. So Ariel, your findings are interesting, and then it makes sense for me, and consistent with what I have seen in Texas. But the conversation in other places, other than outside of Texas, is very different, right? So how would you sell your argument, your findings, to people outside of Texas who cannot realize the positive impact of those educated Mexican immigrants on the economy, not just the Texas economy, but on the U.S. economy?
Why don't you go ahead and take it? Yeah.
That's a great question. One of the things, it's really, for now, you're right, we only looked at Texas, but I think what we have found from a report really does apply to the others. We talked a little bit about the national profile, and that's something that was very similar. If you saw the nationwide level columns when I was showing to them, some of the similar problems persist across the different states. And California maybe being the other states important, but to your point about addressing maybe the smaller states like in the southern states or states like Florida or Illinois, I think you would find some similar actions. But in terms of how do you engage with the others, I think toward what Luisa was talking is we need to make the argument much more broader, not just about Mexicans workers, and in fact not just about Mexican high-skilled workers, but how the whole population of Mexicans and their children are a bigger part of the discussion. How they're integrated or not to each of the economies can have a larger role for each of the states. At the same time, I think it's also a lot to do with trying to have a much more informed discussion about the actual skills. We have seen that this trend of Mexicans, this increase in education and attainment for Mexicans is not just for Mexicans, it's actually across the board for many different immigrants. And so being able to bridge those gaps across Mexicans and other factors is important, because maybe in some communities Mexicans are not the largest numbers, like for example here in the Washington DC area, but bringing other immigrants that have similar issues could then potentially begin to have this discussion about underemployment. And once we do that, then I think we can localize the conversation. It's important for states, of course, as Luisa was pointing, to consider what the economic repercussions are going to be in the near term, but the other part of it too is trying to engage with non-traditional partners, local organizations, and trying to see what may be the other needs that they have. And if you address issues like, for example, if you invest in English education and proficiency for migrants, what other spillover effects they can have on access to their resources or in education of their children, that may be more important. And so making that conversation broader and being able to fine-tune specifically to different conversations and audiences would be important. And I would really venture to think about other ideas of how this research could apply to non-traditional states that we didn't consider yet. But the population certainly is a big population, no matter being the fourth largest in the nation and only the second largest in Texas. There are a lot of other states that we can have similar arguments for.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important what Ariel just said in terms of the spillover, and just we need to get better at telling the story. We've talked about NAFTA, for example. It's different, but for so long NAFTA we didn't need to champion it. We didn't need to say why it was positive, right? There's always been naysayers, but we never really made an argument of why it was such a great. What are the positive effects of NAFTA? To really quantify them and promote them, and become cell marketers. I think this is why this study is so important, is because now we have this data that we need to make sure we get out there. And talking about spillover effects, English proficiency, at least from this nonprofit, has demonstrated that the parents that they get to an English proficiency level, their children are less likely to get sick or end up in the ER. I mean, think about the potential health benefits that it has to have a population that can, just because they can speak or articulate or just have a conversation in English, does that mean they're more likely to seek out a doctor? I mean, we don't know, but what are those implications? Again, what are the spillover effects that can be really positive? And if we can find them, let's quantify them and let's get them out there instead of just having, oh, we think this could be good, but how can it be good and how can we tie it to the economy, which is, it's hard to argue with a good economy. It's really hard to argue. Nobody says, no, I don't want more jobs. No, I don't want more growth. No, GDP is not important. So it's hard to argue if we can tie it to economic benefits.
I saw Maria. Good to see you. Can you
Thank you for
identify
doing
yourself? 'Cause
this.
I know you have a new job, actually.
I
so
do.
very good.
I'm now a digital reporter for Telemundo, so moving on up. I wonder if any of you could talk about the political implications of this data set, because we're in the middle of yet another immigration debate. The White House is drafting a new immigration proposal that would change the system to a merit-based system in terms of legal visas. So how does this report, even though it's still a fraction of the immigrant population, how does this report push back against the narrative that immigrants are a public burden? And, just talk in general about the political implications of this. Thank you.
I may dive in first on that and then go to Ariana and Luisa, which is, I think one of the things that has gotten the least insufficient attention is how highly skilled the immigrants we get in this country are. If we look at just college education, our colleagues have run the numbers again, Jana and Michael, and discovered that about 47 to 48% of immigrants in the past 5 years have a college degree. So that's higher than the Mexican number. But overall we're getting, but even the Mexican number, which we assume Mexican immigrants were less skilled, it is true they're slightly less skilled than immigrants as a whole, but are much more skilled than in the past, right? We're getting a much more, and this is only talking about college education. College education may or may not be the right barometer, right? I mean, some people have argued that college education, college plus, but other people come with other kinds of skills, other kinds of certification. We were looking at middle skilled, we didn't look at the number of people who had high school education or who had technical degrees or other things. But if we could look at that, I think we would find overall we're talking about a much more educated population from Mexico. I mean, I think what it means, there are a few implications. One is, it's a necessary corrective in the conversation to begin thinking that we already have a very talented pool, that if we're going to talk about, recruiting for talent, we're likely already to end up with something similar to what we have coming in. And probably for those who are afraid that a points-based system, depending how it's constructed, right? And there are all sorts of, we just did a paper, actually, a report on on employment-based systems around the world, looking at how points-based versus employer request systems operate in different countries. So in multiple countries around the world, including Australia, New Zealand, Canada, that started all this, but also, the UK and many other countries that have picked this up along the way. Depending how you structure it, and it all depends how you structure it, we might not end up, the sense is always, if you do a points-based system, you're gonna have a lot fewer Mexicans and Latin Americans. That may not be true. That in fact may not be true. If you factor in temporary, depending on what happens with temporary workers, who are, you have a lot of low-skilled, less educated Mexican immigrants coming through some of the worker programs. But if you look at the broader, the points-based system might not make as big a difference, depending how you structure it. And depending how you structure it is key, as some people think. And so less reason, I'm not promoting a points-based system, but it is, the pushback in the past has been, it's going to completely change the composition of who comes in, and that may actually not be as much the case as we once thought. So, Luisa, Ariel, any reactions?
No, completely. I mean, I agree. We agree with you. We don't think it would change, given the changing dynamics that we see in Texas, a points-based system. We actually do believe that we are at a time where we should move to maybe more employment-based or skills-based immigration system. And some of the recommendations our center is making is that each state should actually be part of the conversation, and even if there is maybe an auction for high-skilled visas, each state should participate in their own auction that then would get an allotment of visas based on the workforce needs. So we're actually supportive of any type of change that would look more at points. We think we should remove the country caps. Again, because we don't foresee the changing nature or dynamic of the people coming just because what you've said, and because these trends have been changing, and the rise in education in Mexico, which you've seen for years. So we're not as concerned, and we hope that each state gets to speak to what its needs are. For example, Texas has a deep need for nurses and people in health professions. That would be phenomenal. Talk about the degree recognition. If we can recognize health services degrees from Latin America, that would be tremendous to the Texas workforce needs. So we're okay, but we believe deeply that each state, because North Dakota is different, and they have such small population, they've gotten a lot to artificial intelligence, which is phenomenal, but what they need is going to be very different. So any type of comprehensive immigration system should take into account the voice of each state, and we in Texas are pretty loud, so we think we should have a voice.
The question is a hand right here in the middle, and then we'll go back there.
Hi, Miriam Feldblum from the President's Alliance.
You here,
Thank you.
friend of MPI, former fellow.
Yes. Thank you so much for this great presentation and responses. And I really appreciate your attention to certification. So now let me ask you also about recognizing and enabling undocumented immigrants and students as they're moving through the higher education realm to be eligible for licensure as nurses, doctors, lawyers, but occupational and professional licensure. So what's happening in Texas around that, and then also thinking about SMU and other institutions, what are your thoughts about promoting and supporting the admission of undocumented students going on to professional and graduate programs?
And let me add to that, there's also a question that came from one of our viewers on the live stream. It says, can you comment, this is for Luisa specifically, can you comment on the political will in Texas to accomplish some of the initiatives that you talked about? So we're going to take those two together.
So write it down so I don't forget you. Great question. So, like Ariel hinted to me, it's incredibly interesting that Texas for a long time has had tuition benefits for undocumented students. Something few people know is that actually Texas allows in-state tuition for bordering states in Mexico. So if you are a student in Ciudad Juarez, you actually get in-state tuition at UTEP and at other. So Texas actually has been, I know, doesn't it shock you? It is amazing. So I tell you, because that goes a little bit to the political will question as well. I think that Texas very quietly and thoughtfully and without a lot of noise implements policy changes that are actually pretty beneficial and pretty driven towards integration. And again, this is under a Republican legislature, a Republican governor. So again, when we think of national politics, think that Texas is different, even if the parties might seem the same. Texas for a long time has seen this as an area of just continued growth. Texas' #1 trading partner is Mexico. We've long seen the benefits of really being better together. That's something we keep saying in our center, to better together, and we really do see. So in terms of political will, I think that it's quietly there, especially also from like the Texas-Mexico Trade Coalition, from our businesses and employers who quietly but thoughtfully really do have impact and influence. So the political will is quietly there. We're just not going to be loud about it. And it's long time been there. In terms of like higher education institutions and opportunities, I mean, a couple of years ago, the keynote speaker for commencement graduation was a DACA recipient at SMU. And we were Jose Santoyo. He was phenomenal. And he went on to go to a graduate degree. And again, because of the ability of in-state tuition, what we also have in Texas is TAFSA, so Texas financial aid that it can also be applied for undocumented students. Again, so the policies actually already exist there. It's just making sure that students have the awareness to tap into it. Now, what happens to their legal status, that is a federal question, but Texas very quietly and thoughtfully has already opened some avenues to integrate these students that we've educated for years in order to allow them accessibility to our public schools. And at SMU and in other private institutions, they can have merit scholarships. While they cannot have federal financial aid, they can have the Texas financial aid, and they can also apply for all our different merit scholarships. So So it's there, and we know that they're an important part. It's 10% of the workforce in Texas is undocumented, and so that's more significant than I think the federal
Yes.
number is 5%, right?
Yeah.
So 10% of our workforce is undocumented. So that really tells us that something's happening, because 10% of them is not an insignificant number given the size of the Texas workforce. So it's there. The political will, I think, is there. And I think that working through a way that is through nonprofits that are already doing the work and being more creative instead of having to depend on government. We're low government people in Texas. I mean, we're small government people in Texas. So finding a way that these nonprofits can continue to offer services and having, for example, apprenticeship programs where we bring in the private sector into training programs for documented or undocumented students, so that we can tap into their potential while they're in higher education studying, so they can get some training, job workforce training, so they can be prepared if and whenever there's a change. That, I think, is an area that we should also be considering, and that could be at the local level, at the state level, but we should really get into the private sector, look at apprenticeships and see how they could work for this workforce, whether documented or not. I hope that addresses your question a little bit better.
Go back here and then we'll come here.
My name is Taeko Hoshino. I came from Japan, Institute of Developing Economies, and I am a huge specialist on Mexico in Japan. So, yes.
Great.
When I
You're in
wanted
DC
to,
right now, or are you visiting in Washington, D.C.?
yes, to assist the conference.
Okay,
Yes,
good.
yes.
Wonderful.
So that when I research on the immigration in Mexico, I always open the homepage of MPI. So
it's great to
I
have
want
you
to
here at
express
MPI.
my
That's
gratitude.
wonderful. Well, we should talk. Keep in touch then.
So I have two questions. First is that in the data of the employment of Mexican immigrant graduated education, and the first comes elementary and secondary school. It says teacher of a Spanish-speaking population. It is a question. The second is that and for reading this pamphlet, I have an impression that the employment opportunity is limited in the circle or within the circle of Spanish population community, because that they found their employment as a teacher of Spanish-speaking student. The other part is the employment in the subsidiary of Mexican companies. So that I have that not yet they don't compete with the U.S. graduated citizens. That in the future, not you don't see the friction in the future with the competition among college graduate population, Mexico and the U.S. This is my question. Thank you.
Sure. I want to make sure I answer first the first part of your question. And that's on a table that we have in the report and what I showed here by ranking industries. We have a category called elementary and secondary schools. And in it specifically, there are teachers involved in that, but it is not the only industry that's included. So for example, people who may work as counselors or people who may work as principals or assistants or para-teachers, those will be included also in the elementary and secondary schools. So it is not that they're all teachers. And it's possible that some of them, because of their language skills, are not teachers for that reason. Though your point about being ESL, having ESL teachers in English as a second language teachers would be important to consider too. And then the second piece about the competition, it's true, the competition of Mexican highly skilled immigrants with others, it's one. We didn't document this in the report because we didn't look into it as deeply as I think your question really calls for. But one of the things that we do include in our conclusion specifically is we try to think about this idea of Mexican businesses trying to have a larger U.S. presence and therefore bringing in with them some of their executive directors or executive people, and as well as their staff to come here. So it is possible that is one way not to have as big or direct competition with other workers, but I don't think that would necessarily apply for the whole population. I think there is people that are channeling through Texas education schools and therefore are coming out to try to be in similar jobs with others as well. So it's a small part of the component of it, one that we should do more to understand, but I'm not sure, at least from the data, that we can say any more on that for now.
Want to add anything to it?
I thought it really well. I like plugging in some of our other research as it's tangentially related. Just looking at, again, we look at workforce and complementary. Something we found, it just adds to this body of knowing where they're coming from. And this might concern talking about political rhetoric and concerns about, political will. We did another study that looked at if Mexican workers, documented or otherwise, were complements or substitutes to the Texan workers. And we found that they're actually complements, so they're not substitutes. Every time there is a Mexican worker specifically in Texas, actually there's another job. So that was really a great piece of data too, that because we become like what we consider a single production unit, we make so many things together as Texas and Mexico. Workers complement each other, don't substitute them. Now, before NAFTA, before 1994, that was different. We were actually substituting and taking what jobs would have considered. I say we because I'm a Mexican worker also. I'm a Mexican immigrant, highly skilled Mexican immigrant. They came in Dallas. And so I think that just also aids into the conversation as we're looking at where are they, where are they working? To me, it goes back to their limited professional networks. How do we build those networks for them? But they're not competing for jobs. And again, given the employment levels being so low, they're definitely not competing for jobs. I went to another direction, but I wanted to plug the research.
Yeah, it was good. Done by one of your fellows.
Yes, my senior fellow, Raymond Robertson, fabulous. If you haven't read his research, do so.
Good. And this gentleman here, and then we'll go to Kathleen.
Thank you very much. Mario Bravo. I work in global social development here in Washington. My question might fall outside of the scope of your area of interest, but I think that if you're looking at comprehensive strategies, one might want to look also at the cost of these policies and the impact that they have in the exporting countries. I mean, what cost does Mexico pay for losing taxpayers, educated people who were trained at the college level or, as is the case now, at extremely high education levels? I mean, we're talking about PhDs, postgraduates, highly educated people who are also migrating for different reasons, opportunities or personal interest to the United States. And how these policies, at the end, in a comprehensive view, somebody's paying for them. So does Mexico have to start increasing the language training so that the nurses and their electricians and their mechanics come and fit better in Texas or in the United States? Should Mexico's policies on postgraduate education, which has been going on for 30, 40, or 50 years, continue in the same way in which most of these people never come back, even though they have commitments and legal obligations to do so, but at some point figure out ways? When you have ambassadors who don't come back to Mexico because they prefer to stay here in the think tanks, and we're not talking about middle skilled or highly skilled people, we're talking about extremely highly skilled people which are being lost by this country. And if Mexico doesn't have can't afford this cost, what about Guatemala? What about Nicaragua? What about Honduras, who are losing their nurses and the same skilled people? So I think that this is an area that someone should be looking at. If I was the Minister of Finance in Mexico or the Minister of Education in Mexico, I would really look at, are we doing the right things in creating these skills in these people and then paying them to go into universities in the United States to get postgraduate levels, knowing that they're not going to come back?
Let me jump in on this one, and then you guys, I'm sure, have thoughts on this as well. I mean, I think the conversation has moved for many of us from brain drain to brain circulation because increasingly what we see is people do move, but they also sometimes move back or they sometimes invest in their countries of origin. There's some interesting work going on by a guy named Zeke Hernandez on India actually that shows that Indian entrepreneurs, for example, who work with U.S. entrepreneurs and U.S. venture capital funds tend to lead those venture capital funds actually investing back in India. And so not only do Indian engineers sort of return from Silicon Valley sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but they actually, there tends to be these sort of, and they actually end up being mentors of people who are coming up in doing their own startups in India. And there's sort of this more, because for at least high-skilled workers, we're in a much less bordered world than we used to be. That's not so true of everyone, but for high-skilled workers, the world is much flatter, right? I mean, and so the relationships with their country, even if they've left their country, tend to be much more fluid than it would have been in another era. And so the multiple relationships are much less linear than they once were. But the other thing that's fascinating is that actually there's a net return of Mexicans to Mexico right now. So even though we are talking about the fact that there is sort of a higher skilled group of Mexican immigrants coming to the United States, there are actually more Mexicans returning to Mexico than Mexicans coming to the United States right now. I mean, we lost, Ariel is the one who, I'm going to steal your thunder here because these are your numbers, but the number of Mexican immigrants in the United States, Mexican-born people in the United States dropped from 11.7 million to 11.3 million between 2010 and 2017, right? Am I quoting you correctly? Good. And so there's...
Under skilled worker, right?
That's everyone. We haven't broken it down. It's sort of everyone going back. But it's also a lot of skilled people actually go back. I mean, it's interesting. You have a lot of people actually moving back. Some deportations are a piece of it, but they're a relatively smaller piece of it. You have a lot of people, and oddly enough, there is a net inflow of Americans to Mexico. I mean, at the same time, the number of Mexicans in the U.S. are dropping. The number of Americans in Mexico is going up.
Isn't there 1 million undocumented Americans in Mexico?
There's a million. There's somewhere between 800. Well, yes and no. There's somewhere between 800,000 and 1.8 million Americans in Mexico. So Nikki says the Mexican census says 800,000. The U.S. Embassy, and I think this was announced here in this room by Roberta Jacobson shortly after she left being ambassador, thinks there's 1.5 to 1.8 million Americans living part or full time in Mexico. Many of them are undocumented, but many of them are also dual citizens.
Right.
And so who have not necessarily acquired their Mexican citizenship, but they're entitled to Mexican citizenship. So there's the largest number of children of Mexicans that are going back. But there are also a lot of, if you look at retirees and so on, there's a lot of undocumented people. So I used to be one of them, by the way. I lived undocumented in Mexico. So
I'm just being half funny because I'm like,
No. I mean, and actually the U.S. Embassy has been trying to document even the kids and having trouble doing it. So, I mean, and the Mexican government has, and so, any thoughts from you guys on this?
Well, I think until Mexico fixes its high unemployment rates, people are going to go look for a job where they can find it. So Mexico has to really tighten domestic policy. Gosh, I sound like the new president where domestic policy helps foreign policy. The new Mexican president tends to say that foreign policy is domestic policy. If you've heard him say it, he said it a lot of times. But Mexico does need to fix its rule of law issue again, so that this doesn't happen. I know exactly the program you're talking about, where Mexico sponsors master's and PhD level to go study outside and never come back, even though they have an agreement and it's been paid for the government. So that's a rule of law issue as well. So Mexico really needs to tighten that. But the other thing I think, and why I am a big proponent of the English training in Mexico and that should have stayed as part of education reform, is because it makes Mexicans in Mexico more competitive. As we've seen more companies invest in Mexico, they're looking for a well-trained workforce, and English training is a big plus. If you want to work in AT&T Mexico, you actually are more competitive and can have a great opportunity for a higher salary and a management level if you can speak English. So it's not only that we're training them so they can come here and work here and that we're ready, but that they can actually be competitive in Mexico as well, as we're seeing more foreign countries moving in, and that could be a plus. So let's try to do a brain circulation instead of brain drain. But
can I think it's an important point, and definitely somebody in the Mexican government needs to begin to think about. For a long time, the one of the reasons that maybe hasn't been such as visible issues because of remittances. People who come to the U.S. are seen as a benefit for the Mexican economy because they can send, and the more they send back, the more, hopefully, the more that the system and the structure in Mexico improve. But for in the future, I think that needs to be considered about how effectively that's the case in terms of the economy to that. But Andrew's right that the Mexican migration overall is decreasing, and that some of that would increase. The Mexicans are returning, and that some of them are returning with high skills. The other piece that was, it's indirectly mentioning what Andrew suggested, is that even those Mexicans that are deported back or that are sent back from the U.S. to Mexico do have new skills that the Mexican government would benefit from if they were able to work with them and to reintegrate them into society. Being able to go back, even maybe they only had a sixth grade education when they came to the United States, and they're coming back now with a community college degree. Being able to work with Mexico to try to validate, in this case, U.S. Diplomas would be helpful for them to be able to acquire different positions in Mexico as well. So as much as we talk, I think, in this more fluid transnational flow of Mexicans across the U.S. and Mexico, I think it's important to also think about the people going back to Mexico, how they can create credentialing certification on both countries so that there could be a better understanding. Not that they're bigger numbers, but
for us, so, yeah.
but that maybe there could be a possibility in the future.
Before I go to Jim, Kathleen Newland, my colleague, senior fellow, and one of the founders of MPI.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to Luisa and Ariel for great presentations. I have a very specific question about some of your data, but I can't resist, because I've done a great deal of work on diaspora populations.
Yes, you have
I can't
indeed.
I can't resist responding a little bit to this question about brain drain, because the big sort of global picture tends to reinforce the idea that diaspora populations thicken the networks between the two countries, which is beneficial, especially for large countries of origin like Mexico, which do have centers of excellence that can attract people back, and that combination of universities and companies and financial institutions that can build these sort of hotspots of innovation. And it's much more difficult for smaller, poorer countries to establish the poles of attraction to persuade highly skilled people to come back, especially if they are at the same time suffering from political instability and pervasive criminal violence and so on. So that's an aside. What I wanted to ask Ariel is if there's any way of looking within those sector categories, construction, elementary school education, and it's a little bit related to the question from our colleague from Japan, to see what the skill level is within those. I mean, are college-educated Mexicans in the construction sector working as supervisors and so on? Are college-educated Mexicans in the elementary school sector working as janitors? I mean, how much do we know about that?
A great question. I know at least one person working in Texas, a college-educated Mexican working in construction in Texas, who's incredibly successful, massively successful, and do not know his legal status, but actually massively successful. But that was the entryway when he was in the United States, right? He was not going to be able to exercise his profession. He got in construction. But the fact that he was a professional helped him maneuver so that he ended up running a very successful business, actually. So,
it's a good question, Kathleen. So what we have in the report right now was industries, and that's because they were larger. So under industries, we have occupations, and occupations would allow us to get more into depth about those categories. The issue that, or at least for some of the geographies that we had here, and why we didn't go to the occupation level, is because of the sample size. Occupations are smaller segments of the industry, so therefore make it more difficult to be able to say with confidence where Mexicans are. So maybe it is something that we could do at the state level, but looking at the metropolitan areas may be more difficult, except maybe outside of Houston and Dallas. But certainly it would be a good, going back to the question, trying to identify if it's a teacher, or if it's a para-teacher, or if it's a counselor, trying to identify what that would look like. Not just there, but also in, for example, other fields like we looked at the legal services. Is it attorneys or is it paralegals? Looking in the hospitals, are they nurses? Are they doctors? Are they receptionists? Trying to figure that out would be helpful. but not something that we cover in the report. And if we were to do something like this, we would have to really be looking specifically about the sample sizes.
Another thing, Kathleen, just that kind of ties into your question. One of the things that we are really interested in that we were talking about is also I'd like to see like their average salary. If there's a way to know, because then that we can look at what their impact, like could they afford, the average home, what their spending level could be. There's a lot of data that I think would be nice to see and understand, also to see their economic impact.
Jim, you have the last word, actually. Well, we may have the last word, but you have the last question or comment from the audience, then we'll respond. So.
Since I have the microphone, let's just say what a great collaboration this is, what a great opportunity for SMU, Tower Center, and Texas Mexico to work with MPI, and our reach extends all the way to Japan. We had a great program yesterday on Japan at the Wilson Center, so it's great to see all of these colleagues coming together here. But years ago, I worked on a NSF project with Caroline Bertel looking at cities and asking the question, especially at Dallas-Fort Worth, looking at different immigrant groups. But one of the questions we posed was, looking at the city as context. So I'm wondering if you can say something about the variation, the difference across cities. Is there something special that makes certain cities much more accommodating, providing more opportunities for Mexicans to improve their education? Just El Paso obviously is way up there. I think McAllen was also way up there. Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston a little bit lower. Now, that may simply be a function of the populations and, the skill levels that are there, but it would be great if you could tease out, what's going on in these different metropolitan areas. And it's too bad you don't have Austin because, of course, that would be an interesting point of comparison. So can you tell us something about what's going on in these cities?
To talk to you about the numbers, and maybe Lucy, you can help me to try to underscore and pull apart some of the different level contexts. I think it's important and something that I'm not as familiar with as you may be. But in terms of, at least, you had a good point about trying to understand the stock and the flows that we've seen. At least for Houston and for Dallas, with much larger populations, it's going to take a longer time for recent flows to actually make a significant change in the stock of the population. Whereas in El Paso and the other groups, it's smaller populations that require less time to change that profile. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some unique characteristics. And some of the things that I alluded to in the beginning was that really Dallas having, for example, a larger female population than any of the other cities that we looked at. So it's something about Dallas may be important there to look into, analyze. The younger populations, I think in El Paso it was that I highlighted before. So there are certain dynamics of it. For example, McAllen having much older population, McAllen having also, assumingly because of the older populations, also more issues about English proficiency at the later ages. So that's important to consider. But I don't know if I have enough precise information about what could be different. I mean, San Antonio, yep. And about Austin, as I mentioned, we had the number. About 16,000 Mexicans there with high skilled, with college degrees or higher, which is 13%. So they actually would 13% of the population. So they actually would fall a little bit higher than Dallas and Houston, but we just cannot speak about the actual demographics because of the sample size. But overall, I think certainly there's something to be said about that. And specifically, maybe thinking more about the broader makeup of the Latin American populations in this country, in these cities. For example, in Houston, having a more significant Central American presence than others. Maybe they have less concentrated ties or cultural activities that maybe, I'm not saying that's the complete solution, but there are different factors that I'm sure can be. In terms of policies or dynamics or climate, maybe Lucy,
Well, I think that it's to the heart of, in my mind, for professional networks and also education networks. So if we look at the cities that they were more likely integrated, one, they've had migration flows that have been larger, as you know, for a long time, right? El Paso, McAllen, there's been more Mexican migrants there than maybe in the northern cities for a longer time. But also, I would, I might ask Jenny to look at while I'm answering, is that what percentage of the major institutions, universities, have a big percentage of Mexican immigrants? And I say this because university help you, huh? UT is one of the universities build your professional network. So it might be that, again, because they were more integrated in the institutions that help you build professional networks, they're more likely to then have the professional networks to grow and be established in the border cities. And I'm almost sure that, again, I would have to look up the numbers, but that in these border communities, McAllen and El Paso, and we look at their universities, they will have a large percentage of Mexican students. And again, help them build their networks. Also, they're closer to home, so they might have already had the networks there and established professionals that can open doors for them. I would go that it's very likely that is, but maybe we should look into it more deeply, because I don't think economic policies are the same across the state, and really the city policies have nothing to do in terms of ease of business. That's state policies, unless there's burdens that are put by cities or burdens incentives offered by cities to migrants, but I don't know that we have that granular level data. I think more it's again on education and professional networks, but Kathleen, you might know if we have that level of granular data.
Yeah, I think the question is sort of more focused on on municipal government policies, and there is quite a difference there amongst cities. Dallas, for example, has a strong Office of Immigrant Affairs. I'm sure they all have Offices of Immigrant Affairs, but Dallas, I think, is the only Texan city I've seen at international conferences of mayors and so on. And that kind of thing over time, has an impact on integration. If people can get access, as in New York, to a sort of city card that's a form of identification that allows them to open bank accounts and things like that. So I think it'd be interesting to look, across these variations at what municipal policies are, as well as what the numbers are.
Especially those long-term ones, because that city of welcoming communities in Dallas is actually fairly new. So it'd be interesting over time. So and to see if El Paso and McAllen have similar things for longer. That'd be interesting.
And also look at the universities.
No, the to me, it's the universities. It's my whole point. It's the universities that built up the professional networks, and they've just been doing it for longer than other universities.
I throw out one more thing, which is also you have economic clusters, right? I mean, the border cities are economic clusters.
Right.
San Antonio and Monterrey, Mexico's financial and industrial capital, are a cluster as well. And you have investment flowing in both directions. And so you have increasingly Mexican businesses. I don't think this is the dominant pattern. I think education is much more likely. But you do also have Mexican companies like Mission Foods, for example, or Cemex, second largest cement company in the world, Mexican company, or Lala, which is Borden Milk, which is in Dallas, Texas, which are investing in Bimbo bakeries, largest bakery in the U.S. And then you have a lot of smaller in the world, actually, right? And then you have a lot of smaller companies when you get to the border region. And probably in Texas, smaller supermarket chains and others that are Mexican in origin that open up in the United States. And so that investment flow also ties to human capital flow.
But looking at how the public universities are in each of these cities, I think that's...
Yeah, very much so. Thank you, everybody. We could go on. I know that there's more, desire to, but this was fabulous. Really appreciate your attendance. Thank you to everyone who joined us on the live cast as well. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, SMU. And
thank you, MPI.